Focus on Abilities was brought to you by Tier Memorial Hermann, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence. And the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden. I'll be your host for today's program. We're taping today on location at Tier Memorial Hermann. We're glad you're here as our guest. We have a special guest to present you, and I'll introduce her right after we take a break. So please stay tuned. You're watching Focus on Abilities. Welcome to Focus on Abilities this morning. I'm Lex Frieden, and we have a very special guest with us here. We're on location at Tier Memorial Hermann in the Research Center, and we're very pleased to have with us Maria Town. Maria is the disability liaison for President Obama. She works in the White House, and she will share with us some really inside information about disability policy, about the role of people with disabilities in the White House and in the nation. So we're glad you're with us today. It's a pleasure now to introduce to you Maria Town. Maria, welcome to Focus on Abilities.
Thank you, Lex. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, Maria, your title is Executive Assistant to the yada, yada, yada. What are all those words?
So I'm a Senior Associate Director in the White House Office of Public Engagement, and I manage the Disability Portfolio and the Aging Americans Portfolio.
So, in other words, anybody who comes to the White House with an issue pertaining to disability or aging are directed to you?
They can be. So one of the things that I've done since coming into the White House is help to establish the position of Chief Accessibility Officer for the Executive Office of the President. So when I got into my role, I not only had to deal with policy issues and informing the president of the needs and desires of the disability community, I also got a lot of questions about things like physical access and how do I book a sign language interpreter, right? So we have this new person at the White House who is able to manage all of those requests, and he will be there throughout the next administration as well.
So that's not a political job.
No.
That's going to be a staff position within the White House.
Exactly.
That's really important because I've been there before when there's been a lot of mix-up about who's supposed to be responsible for this and that. And that's a real great addition, and compliments to you for organizing that and seeing that it happens. It's not easy to establish a new position in the federal bureaucracy.
Especially one that will be there forever, right? Yeah, so for me, and I still do get a lot of kind of access questions, but if members of the disability community or the aging community have specific thoughts on actions that the Obama administration should take, I manage those, and I also make sure that in key speeches that the president gives or key events that the White House puts on, that the disability community and older Americans are there to participate.
Maria, that your role then is to follow the calendar, see what the president is scheduled to do, and then ensure that people are appropriately invited to these events?
That's one of the things I do, and what that requires that I do is make sure I know what the Office of Science and Technology Policy is doing, and that I know what the Office of the First Lady is doing. And what's been great is that because I've worked to establish relationships across the White House, now people proactively reach out to me and say, you know, we're working on this event honoring young people in the arts. Are there any great young people with disabilities doing fantastic things? And I'm able to make some recommendations.
So before you got there and began to introduce yourself to these people, that would not necessarily have occurred, right?
Well, thankfully, before I got there, I follow in a line of disability community liaisons who are all fantastic. But one of the things that makes my role at the White House slightly different was that the White House hired me full-time. So what a lot of people don't know is that many of the White House staff are there for a really short-term basis. They're on loan from other agencies. But because I left my agency job, I've been there for a little over a year and a half now, which is a long time for the White House, and have been able to build up a lot of relationships in good faith.
Another thing that I think people don't realize, and you talked about the people who were your predecessors in this job, those people aren't paid a lot of money for that job.
No, and this was the benefit of coming from an agency, because you keep that agency salary, but I am not paid a lot in my job, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's, I think, a fallacy that people have, and I think it's a good thing to clear up. On the other hand, doing that job gives you experience that you'd probably never have in any other job in the world.
That's absolutely true. And there are so many phenomenal things that I've been able to do. One of my favorite memories is when we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, where I first met you, Lex. There is a phenomenal disability leader and advocate named Alice Wong, and she has really transformed the way I think the country thinks about disability community and disability history. And I knew that for the anniversary, I wanted her to be there and I wanted her to meet the president. But because of the risks involved in flying, Alice does not travel and she lives in California. So I had to figure out how to get Alice there without her actually flying. So we arranged to use a telepresence robot. And when I briefed the president before he came out to meet these advocates, the first thing I said was, hello, Mr. President, thank you for all you've done for the disability community. The first guest you will meet is a robot.
I remember that, and I remember the president walking up to the robot, and it was quite a sight to see this inanimate object. I mean, it was on a stand, flat, and just a screen, like an iPad screen or something, standing there.
And they danced together, and Alice was able to be in the event, yeah.
The president walks up and he's talking to this object, to this robot, just like it's a real person. And in fact, on the other end of that connection was a real person, exactly. Alice. And that was an amazing, and that, has implications not only for disability. I mean, people who watched that, who weren't particularly interested or knowledgeable about disability, could see the use of technology that some of us may experience later on in life and really benefit from.
Exactly.
So you had to kind of sort that out, right?
Absolutely.
It must have been a challenge to find a vendor who could provide that robot and assure you that it wouldn't go down in the midst of a conversation with the president?
Yes, and there were definitely some interesting conversations with senior White House officials when I said, here is my strategy for how the president's going to meet a robot during the 80th anniversary. And they said, well, okay, we've never done this before, so first time for everything.
Let's talk about some more first-time things, but we'll do that after a break. We want to give everybody the opportunity to bring your friends in to watch the show. We're going to take a short break here, but we'll be right back. Stay tuned to Focus on Abilities. Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden. We're here with Maria Town from the White House. Maria, you were talking about Alice Lynn's conversation with the president by robot and telecommunications. There must have been some shock with the IT people inside the White House when you told them you wanted to wire up a robotic link to California. The security on the Wi-Fi must have been a real challenge for them.
Yes, but it's not a challenge that they were unfamiliar with encountering. Increasingly, the White House has had to deal with setting up limited Wi-Fi signals to create access, whether it's access for an individual person or for large groups of people that we have coming in for a briefing that we're live streaming. So one of the things that I've been grateful for in my role is that any of the major events that I put on at the White House can be live streamed if I get clearance. And what that does is create an opportunity for so many more Americans to participate. And what we like to have happen is we'll establish a hashtag for all of our events so that audience members can tweet as they're in the room, but so can people who are watching on the live stream, and a larger conversation can occur while the event is going on.
That's an innovation that's occurred only in the last few years.
Yes.
Even the tweeting by the White House is something that we wouldn't have seen, 5 years ago. That's probably. True. And I think you and some of your colleagues, probably all millennials, brought Twitter with them to the White House and decided this is a way to export this important message, right?
I think so. And the disability community is really active online. And this is something that both myself and my boss, Paulette Aniskoff, have really pressed in the White House. And one of the examples of where we've been very successful is we produced a ASL West Wing tour.
ASL is American Sign Language.
Yes. And so we created this video product that features the receptionist of the United States, Leah Katz-Hernandez, giving a tour of the West Wing in American Sign Language. She's deaf. The video also features audio description and open captioning so that it can be viewed by anyone, regardless of whether or not they can hear or whether or not they can see. That video is one of the most watched White House videos of all time.
Well, Maria, can you give us the URL or direct us to that site?
Sure. You can if you just Google ASL West Wing Tour, it'll come up. It's on the White House YouTube channel. It was also picked up by Huffington Post, ABC, and a few other outlets.
Wow. And the woman who actually guides the tour is a deaf woman?
Yes.
What's her job again?
So Leah is the receptionist of the United States. She sits at the very front desk in the West Wing, and I just think it's so awesome. So no matter who comes into the West Wing, whether it's the Pope or R2-D2, both of those have happened, they are greeted by a deaf woman in American Sign Language. And she has an interpreter that accompanies her throughout the day. But it really, to me, showcases how much the Obama administration has embraced inclusion.
Well, let me ask you about that. Are there many people with disabilities who are working in the White House?
So I think there could be more people with disabilities working in the White House. And like so many moments for disability community building, what I've been able to do is informally, when I see somebody, I make sure to reach out to them and talk with them and say, do you identify as a part of the disability community? How can we work together and support one another? And what we have done is set up an accessibility and inclusion working group across all of the White House, including political and career components. And this has brought together not just employees with disabilities, but employees without disabilities who are allies in the disability movement.
That could be a best practice for other companies too. I mean, I suspect there are many workplaces, many companies where there are people with disabilities in the environment who don't, as you said, identify as a person with a disability. I happen to know some people who have hidden disabilities,
right,
and they wouldn't ordinarily out themselves. Yet if they realized there was an opportunity to get peer support and an opportunity to be an advocate, they might take on a different role in that regard.
When we did, for the 26th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we did a takeover of the White House Instagram featuring employees with disabilities. And it was my goal to feature diverse employees who worked in a number of different jobs across the White House. And one of my core beliefs is that people with disabilities shouldn't only have to work in disability-related jobs, right? If I were interested in climate change and or drones, right? I could go work on drones if I wanted to. And one of the people that I reached out to see if she wanted to be profiled had never really talked with me about disability, and I wasn't sure how she identified, but she worked in presidential personnel, which is the arm of the White House that's responsible for recruitment, and I wanted to make sure people knew about it. And so when I talked with her, she said, Maria, I don't usually talk about my disability, I don't write about it, but I would be willing to do this. And so she wrote a great profile for herself and received so much positive feedback from her colleagues, from her friends, from people that she didn't know, that I think it was a turning point for her.
She was a person with a hidden disability.
She was a person with a disability that wasn't too apparent. It's one of those things, like you and I probably have a we see somebody and we're like, okay, you might have mild cerebral palsy, for example, that most people wouldn't necessarily pick up on. But yeah.
What about people with impairments, psychiatric impairments? Are those people becoming more visible in Washington, D.C., in your experience working on policy? Are policies becoming more sensitized, policymakers, to the large population of folks we have with psychiatric impairments in this country?
I think so. I think there is a greater move towards people being open about various their various relationships with mental health. Right now, a bill that just got passed out of the House of Representatives is the 21st Century Cures Act, and we have really seen a number of different mental health related organizations have very different views on this bill, and I think more leaders in Congress, for example, are having to contend with the various perspectives on how we as a nation need to manage and create opportunities for people living with mental health conditions.
And in regards to, again, your perspective in Washington, D.C., the ADA was passed 26 years ago now. Is there still an emphasis on ADA compliance?
Within government?
Yeah,
or?
within government, yeah.
Yes, there absolutely is. And there's still a need for citizens to file complaints and make sure the government knows where businesses and local communities are not in compliance. One of the biggest issues, I think, facing the disability community and the country has to do with ADA compliance and technology. Websites are a great example. I think right now we are in a space where we are retrofitting websites. And you live in Texas, I'm from Louisiana. I have memories of retrofitting homes with those window unit air conditioners where literally only one room is cold during a 98-degree day. Retrofitting is not an elegant solution, and that's because we have built the internet with a lot of barriers for people who use assistive technology, for example.
So when you talk about retrofitting the internet, you're talking about a website that people who are visually impaired don't have access to, and instead of remaking that to be fully accessible, they add tags that can be read if you have the right kind of software and know where to look on the page.
Exactly, and it's not just people with visual impairments, it's also folks who may have a kind of visual processing disorder and need a page read to them, or folks who have limited dexterity in their hands, for example. There are any host of number of reasons that a website should be accessible, but part of the issue is that the way that coding is not taught with inclusion and accessibility in mind. In most cases, there are some programs doing a great job, but I think the internet can remove a lot of barriers for people with disabilities, and we can do things like work from home when necessary, which is a great boon for a lot of folks, and it can connect more people with disabilities together, but it also creates a lot of additional barriers, and if we're not thinking through how we make all of our virtual interactions more accessible and inclusive, we are further segregating people with disabilities from society.
So Maria, it's clear that technology and communications are some of your personal priorities, and you've been able to bring that to the White House. There are other priorities you must have. I want to ask you about those,
Sure.
And we'll do that. We're going to take a break right now. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. You're watching HTV. This is Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden, and our guest on the program today is none other than Maria Town from the White House. Maria, you've talked about some of the White House priorities, some of your own priorities and interests. Are there others that we should magnify at this point in time?
Absolutely. I think one of the persistent priority issues within the disability community is employment. And I'm very proud to say that the President issued an executive order to increase disability hiring in the federal government. And he stated that he wanted the federal government to hire 100,000 people with disabilities into federal service within 5 years. Within 5 years, the Obama administration was able to hire 109,000 permanent full-time career federal employees with disabilities. That is enormous. And what agencies had to do was submit a number of plans that went through how they would recruit, hire, onboard individuals with disabilities, and then their plans for accommodations and making sure that their workplaces were inclusive.
So dating back to the Clinton administration, President Clinton made the same kind of commitment, but my perception is not nearly as many people were hired, and the reason that was is there was no follow-through, no kind of accountability. The effort that President Obama made included this looped-in accountability, which obviously had an impact.
It did, and it really is a testament to the leadership at these various federal agencies that we were able to be successful in that goal. You know this better than most, an executive order ends with the presidency. And so I think one of the biggest things that we're trying to finish up right now is actually institutionalizing some of those best practices that came out of our experience hiring those individuals with disabilities. And when you also look at part-time and non-career, I think we've hired 153,000 people with disabilities into federal service.
So it is very important. When I was director of the National Council on Disability, a small federal agency, the one thing that I did know was that anyone whom I hired into the federal service had a job there as long as they did their job and performed well. They were safe from these changes in administration. They were safe from the political whims and flows, and they had a job, again, as long as they did their job well. And everybody I hired, I guarantee you, did their job well, and many of them are still there. So that's that. People ask me what I achieved when I was director of NCD, in addition to a number of important policy recommendations, not the least of which was the ADA. The people whom I hired who will have an impact on my grandchildren are among the most important things that I did there. And I think your experience probably working in the White House leaves you feel good, even though you leave at the end of this administration. It makes you feel like you've done some things that will have a stick power.
Absolutely. But what I hope will come as a result of our success as a federal government is that more private companies, large and small, will realize that disability is a part of the fabric of diversity, and having employees with disabilities is a big benefit to a business. So some of those best practices that we've identified, I hope that they're adopted in other places of business across the country.
Well, by having the president participate in some of these activities that you've been able to get him to participate in, willingly, by the way, I think that's been a model for others. The president is highly rated. He's regarded as a role model for many people, and to see him reaching out to engage people with disabilities is so important. And behind the scenes, you've been there calling people, keeping track of who's who, trying to make sure that you had everybody's phone number and email address, and you could get to them at a moment's notice. And that's been very important, and we really all have benefited from your work there. And you have established a kind of a standard. You mentioned the people before you, and there were some great people, and I love them. They're good friends of mine. I don't know that any of them actually have been able to create change that will be as lasting as that you've created.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Lex. That means a lot.
Maria, the one question that I think my colleagues would want me to ask of you is, does the president call you in the middle of the night and ask you disability questions?
No, he does not. And the president is actually really, really good at leaving the office at around 6:30 to go have dinner with his family. And the key is making sure that anything you're contributing to his briefing book is there before then. We do not want to be, or I do not want to be the one person who is keeping the president from time with his family.
So he gets briefed, or he takes the book with him when he goes home? Is that the way it works?
Yeah. So I will get questions about disability in the middle of the night from people all the way up the chain in my office, but they won't come from him.
And you answer the questions, and they wind up in that briefing book so that the president will read them and have knowledge of them. That's interesting. Are you able to add any kind of opinionated, your own opinion? Can you?
When I write briefs, they don't usually come from, I think this as an example, but there are many steps that I have to take to get to a memo that winds up in the president's briefing book. And so a lot of my opinion and my judgment is factored into the decisions that are reflected in that final memo. If that
And
makes sense.
Maria, when the president makes a speech, do you review all the speeches before he speaks?
Not all the speeches. If there's a speech where we know disability content will be kind of a factor, I help to review and inform that content with the presidential speech writing team.
And that's another question. The speech writing team, are they all pretty well tuned into disability? In other words, they're not going to put in things like the disabled and the handicapped and so on?
Yeah, they're great, and it was really, it was a really funny experience when I first came on and we had to work on the 80th anniversary, because the anniversary happened very soon after I started. And I remember working on the president's speech with a really wonderful speechwriter, and I can't remember exactly what the language was, I'll have to go back through my email, but she put in a metaphor having to do with blindness as like a bad thing, right? Or saying, that something was short-sighted. And I just remember telling her, we can't say those things in this speech. And she was like, oh my goodness, I've never thought about it, right?
Wow.
And there are so many ubiquitous phrases in our everyday conversational speech that utilize disability as a metaphor for weakness or as a metaphor for negative things. And so having her come to that realization and begin to question these phrases that we all kind of take for granted was a big turning point.
That's a wonderful story, Maria. Many more I'm sure you have to tell. We don't have all day here on the program because HTV runs in schedules, and our scheduled time is running out. But I do want to thank you for being our guest here today, and thank you for coming to Houston from Washington, D.C. to share your views with us, to have an opportunity to see Tier Memorial Herman, to have an opportunity. You're going to meet the mayor later this week.
I'm very excited.
And he's the best mayor in America. I'm sure you'll agree with that when after you've met him. And we're looking forward to seeing you back in Houston many times. So Maria Town has been our guest today. I appreciate all of you watching. And Maria, you're the best.
Thank you, Lex. You are too.
Stay tuned. I'll be back with a closing comment. You're watching Focus on Abilities. You've been watching Focus on Abilities on HTV. I'm Lex Frieden, and it's an honor for me to be your host and to have on the program today Maria Town, who's responsible for Disability Liaison and Aging Liaison in the White House. It's a special program. We've had a special time with Maria, and we hope that you've all enjoyed our program. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. Come back for more Focus on Abilities next time on HTV.
Focus on Abilities was brought to you by Tier Memorial Herman, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence, and the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.